The North Atlantic, 1943. While the world's attention focused on massive naval battles and strategic bombing campaigns, one Norwegian fisherman's absurd idea would save more lives than an entire destroyer squadron. His name was Henrik Olsen, and military commanders laughed at his design until desperation forced them to listen. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story of ingenuity and courage, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more amazing historical stories like this one. Henrik stood on the deck of his fishing vessel, the Nordstjerne, watching another rescue patrol return empty-handed. The waters off the Norwegian coast had become a graveyard for Allied airmen. Bomber crews, limping back from raids over occupied Europe, often couldn't make it home. Fighter pilots engaged in dogfights ditched into the freezing Atlantic with alarming frequency. The survival rate was less than 30%, and it wasn't the Germans killing them, it was the sea itself. The morning fog hung thick over the harbor in Scalloway, Shetland Islands, where Henrik had relocated after the German occupation of Norway. At 52 years old, with weathered hands and a face carved by decades of North Atlantic winds, he'd spent his entire life reading the moods of the ocean. Now, watching young men die in waters he knew, like his own heartbeat, something inside him broke. His workshop smelled of tar, hemp, and wood shavings. Charts covered every wall, marked with red crosses where pilots had gone down. Henrik had been tracking them obsessively for months. His daughter, Ingrid, brought him coffee that had long gone cold. She was 24, working as a translator for the British forces, and she saw the toll this mission was taking on her father. Papa, you haven't slept in 3 days, she said softly, her English accent now stronger than her Norwegian one. Henrik didn't look up from his sketches. Commander Blackwood said my design was ridiculous, called it a fisherman's fantasy. Maybe he's right to be skeptical. 3 pilots died yesterday, Ingrid. 3 boys, younger than you, floating in the water while rescue boats searched in the wrong places. We don't have time for skepticism. The problem was deceptively simple. When a pilot ditched, the clock started immediately. In the Atlantic's frigid waters, hypothermia set in within 20 minutes. Rescue boats could take an hour or more to reach the location, even when they had accurate coordinates. By then, most pilots had either drowned or succumbed to the cold. Life vests kept them floating, but the ocean's temperature was the real killer. Henrik had witnessed it firsthand just 2 weeks earlier. A young Canadian pilot, barely 20 years old, had ditched his Spitfire 3 miles from shore. Henrik's fishing vessel was the closest boat, and they reached him in 18 minutes. The boy was still conscious when they pulled him from the water, his lips blue, his body convulsing uncontrollably. They wrapped him in every blanket they had, tried to warm him with their own body heat, but his core temperature had dropped too far. He died in Henrik's arms before they reached the harbor, whispering something about his mother in Toronto. That night, Henrik couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the boy's face, kept hearing that final whisper. Ingrid found him at dawn, sitting on the dock, staring at the horizon where the rescue had failed. You did everything you could, she'd said. Everything wasn't enough, he'd replied. 18 minutes? We were so close, but the water killed him anyway. There has to be a better way. That's when the idea first crystallized. Not just marking locations or providing flotation, but creating a system that actively fought against hypothermia. Something that kept a pilot's body out of the killing cold of the water itself. Henrik's solution came from 40 years of fishing herring. He'd noticed how certain net configurations created visible patterns on the water's surface, how floats arranged in specific ways could be spotted from remarkable distances. What if you could combine this with a system that not only marked a pilot's location, but actively kept them alive? His design was unconventional, a series of connected floating platforms, each about 6 feet square, linked by rope and equipped with what he called catch baskets. These baskets hung below the surface, designed so that a person in the water could swim into them and be held securely above the waterline. The entire system was bright orange, visible from aircraft, and incorporated reflective materials that would shine in searchlight beams at night. But the truly innovative part was the deployment method. Instead of dropping individual life rafts, aircraft could release these interconnected platform systems in clusters. They would spread across a wide area, creating a visible rescue zone. Multiple pilots from the same downed aircraft could reach different platforms but remain connected, preventing them from drifting apart in the current. The catch baskets themselves were Henrik's masterstroke. Drawing from decades of observing how fish behaved in nets, he designed them with a wide mouth that funneled down to a secure holding area. A pilot, even one weakened by cold or injured, could simply float into the opening. The basket's buoyancy would then lift them partially out of the water, keeping their torso dry and significantly reducing heat loss. Small hand grips inside allowed them to stabilize themselves, and a canvas cover could be pulled over for additional protection from wind and spray. Henrik built his first prototype in his living room, much to Ingrid's dismay. Canvas, rope, and wooden frames littered every surface. He tested components in his bathtub, then in the harbor at night when no one would see him. The local Norwegian community thought he'd lost his mind, this old fisherman splashing around in the freezing water at 3 a.m, timing how long it took to climb into his strange contraption. But every test revealed improvements. Basket opening needed to be wider. The hand grips needed to be positioned differently for someone wearing bulky flight gear. The buoyancy distribution required constant adjustment to prevent the platforms from flipping in rough seas. Each failure taught him something new. Each success brought him closer to a design that could actually save lives. Commander William Blackwood was a career Navy man, 48 years old, who'd seen too many gimmicks and miracle solutions that failed under real conditions. When Henrik first presented his design at a briefing in late March, Blackwood's response was cutting. "Mr. Olson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have trained engineers working on these problems. Your net baskets would never survive deployment from a moving aircraft. The weight distribution is all wrong. The platforms would flip in any significant swell. And frankly, we don't have the resources to waste on untested civilian ideas." Henrik stood his ground, his Norwegian accent thick, but his English clear. "Commander, I have fished these waters for 37 years. I know how materials behave in the Atlantic. I know what stays afloat and what sinks. You're losing men because your life rafts drift too quickly and can't be seen in poor visibility. My system solves both problems." "Your system is theoretical. Our life rafts are proven technology." "Your proven technology has a 30% survival rate." The room went silent. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but Henrik continued. "I'm not trying to disrespect your expertise, Commander. I'm trying to save lives with mine. Give me one test, one deployment. If it fails, I'll never waste your time again." Blackwood stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Do you have any idea how many crackpot inventors come through these doors? Men with ideas about unsinkable ships, underwater breathing apparatus, floating fortresses. Every one of them convinced they've solved problems that actual engineers have been working on for years, and every single one of them wrong." "I'm not an inventor," Henrik said quietly. "I'm a fisherman. I don't know about fortresses or breathing apparatus, but I know the ocean. I know it better than any engineer who learned from textbooks. And I know that right now, while we're standing here arguing, there are pilots training for missions they might not survive. Not because of the Germans, but because we don't have a better way to keep them alive in the water." Blackwood's face reddened. "You're dismissed, Mr. Olson." Henrik gathered his drawings, his hand steady despite the rage building in his chest. At the door, he turned back. "How many pilots have you pulled from the water, Commander?" "Excuse me?" "How many have you personally pulled from the Atlantic? Felt their skin cold as ice? Watched their lips turn blue? Heard them call for their mothers as hypothermia shut down their bodies?" Blackwood said nothing. "I've pulled 7, Henrik continued. "Only 2 survived. So yes, I'm just a fisherman, but I know what it feels like to be too late. And I'm telling you, we can do better. We have to do better." He left before Blackwood could respond, but the words hung in the room long after. Blackwood dismissed him, but Ingrid, who had been translating technical documents in an adjacent office, heard the entire exchange. That night she approached her supervisor, a logistics officer named Captain Margaret Thornton. Margaret was 36, Cambridge educated, and one of the few women in a position of real authority in the military structure. She'd climbed through the ranks by being smarter and working harder than everyone around her, and she had little patience for incompetence. But she also recognized talent wherever it appeared. "Your father's design," Margaret said, reviewing Henrik's sketches spread across her desk. "It's strange, but there's logic here. The interconnected platform concept could work." "He's not asking for much," Ingrid replied. "Just one test. He'll build the prototype himself." "Commander Blackwood won't authorize it." "Then maybe someone higher up should see it." Margaret looked at Ingrid carefully. "You're asking me to go over Blackwood's head. That's career suicide if this fails. And if it works, how many lives could we save?" It took Margaret 3 weeks to get the design in front of Rear Admiral James Cunningham, who commanded naval operations in the region. Cunningham was 55, Scottish, and pragmatic to his core. He'd lost 2 nephews to the Atlantic, both pilots, who'd survived their aircraft crashes only to die waiting for rescue. "Build your prototype, Mer Olson," Cunningham said during their brief meeting. "You have 6 weeks and a budget of £300. If your contraption works half as well as you claim, we'll consider production." Henrik worked like a man possessed. His workshop became a factory, with Ingrid managing materials, procurement, and several other Norwegian refugees volunteering their time. They used cork, treated canvas, aluminum frames, and braided rope that Henrik insisted must be sourced from a specific supplier in Scotland. The weather in April was brutal. Rain hammered the Shetland Islands day and night, wind howling off the Atlantic with enough force to tear shingles from roofs. Henrik worked through it all, his fingers raw from rope burns, his back aching from hunching over his workbench. "You're going to kill yourself," Ingrid warned, finding him asleep at his desk at 4 a.m, technical drawings stuck to his cheek. "Better me than another pilot," he muttered, already reaching for his tools. The first prototype was ready in 5 weeks. The system consisted of 12 interconnected platforms, each measuring 6 feet by 6 feet, linked by 50-foot rope segments. The catch baskets hung 18 inches below the surface, designed with a funnel entry that would guide a swimmer in but prevent them from falling out. Each platform had reflective strips, dye markers that would color the surrounding water bright green for visibility, and small flags that would help rescuers spot the location from a distance. The test was scheduled for early May, a relatively calm morning with 3-foot swells. Commander Blackwood attended, his skepticism undisguised. Admiral Cunningham was there as well, along with Margaret Thornton and a film crew to document the results. A Wellington bomber made 3 passes, dropping the system from different altitudes. The first 2 attempts were promising, but showed flaws in the deployment mechanism. The third drop, from 800 feet, was nearly perfect. The platform spread across the water in a deliberate pattern, the catch baskets deploying correctly, the whole system remaining stable despite the swell. Henrik watched from the deck of an escort vessel, his heart pounding so hard he thought his ribs might crack. Ingrid stood beside him, gripping his arm. "It's working, Papa. Look, it's actually working." The real test came next. 6 Navy volunteers wearing full flight gear jumped from the escort vessel at different points around the platform system. The exercise simulated multiple crew members from a downed bomber, scattered across a 200-yard area by parachutes and wind. In less than 4 minutes, all 6 men had reached platforms and secured themselves in the catch baskets. They remained stable, protected from the worst of the swell, visible from both the air and the surface. The green dye markers created a visible stain on the ocean that could be seen from over a mile away. Commander Blackwood said nothing during the demonstration, but his expression had shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. When the volunteers were recovered and the system retrieved, he approached Henrik on deck. "The deployment mechanism needs refinement," Blackwood said, "and the platform edges are too sharp. They could cause injuries, but fundamentally..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Fundamentally, Mr. Olson, you might have something here." It wasn't an apology, but from a man like Blackwood, it was as close as Henrik would get. Admiral Cunningham was more enthusiastic. "I want 50 units in production within 3 months. Captain Thornton, you'll oversee the manufacturing process. Commander Blackwood, you'll work with Mr. Olson on the necessary modifications. Whatever resources you need, you have them." Production began immediately. Henrik's design was refined by military engineers, but the core concept remained unchanged. The biggest challenge was manufacturing at scale. Britain's industrial capacity was stretched to its absolute limit by weapons production, shipbuilding, and aircraft manufacturing. Finding factory space for an untested rescue system was nearly impossible. Margaret Thornton solved the problem with characteristic efficiency. She requisitioned a textile mill in Aberdeen that had partially shut down due to material shortages. Within 2 weeks, she had the space converted for platform production, with Henrik supervising quality control on every unit. The work was grueling. The mill operated 20 hours a day, with workers in rotating shifts. Henrik insisted on inspecting every platform personally, checking every seam, testing every rope connection, verifying every reflective strip. He became obsessed with perfection, knowing that any flaw could mean the difference between life and death. Ingrid worked as liaison between the Norwegian construction crews and the British military coordinators. Her fluency in both languages and her technical knowledge made her invaluable. She also kept her father from working himself to death, forcing him to eat regular meals and sleep at least 5 hours a night. But the strain was taking its toll on both of them. One evening in June, Ingrid found her father in the quality control area, unpicking the stitching on a platform that had passed 3 previous inspections. "Papa, what are you doing? That unit was approved." "The stitching is uneven here," Henrik said, pointing to a seam that looked identical to all the others. "It could fail under stress." "It passed the load test. It passed the immersion test. It's fine." "It's not fine. It has to be perfect." "Nothing is perfect, Papa. Not in war, not in manufacturing, not in life." "Then men will die." Ingrid grabbed her father's hands, forcing him to stop. "Men are dying right now, this very moment, while you're unpicking stitching that doesn't need to be fixed. 40 platforms are sitting in that warehouse, ready to be deployed, ready to save lives. But you won't release them because you're chasing impossible perfection." "I can't send out anything less than my best work." "Your best work is sitting in that warehouse. What you're doing now isn't quality control, it's fear. You're afraid that, despite everything you've done, despite all these months of work, it still won't be enough. And you're right, it won't be enough to save everyone, but it will be enough to save some, and some is better than none. Henrik looked at his daughter, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight she carried supporting him through his obsession. When did you become the wise one? About the time you forgot to be, she said gently. Release the platforms, Papa. Let them do what they were designed to do. Trust your work. The next morning, Henrik authorized the release of 47 completed platform systems. Within a week, they were being loaded onto bombers and fighter bombers across Britain. The waiting was almost worse than the work had been. The first operational units were deployed in late July. Bomber Command began carrying the Olsen platforms, as they'd been officially designated, on all long-range missions over the North Atlantic and North Sea. Fighter squadrons operating from Scotland and Iceland followed suit. The first confirmed rescue came on August 3rd. A B-17 Flying Fortress, returning from a raid over Hamburg, lost 2 engines to flak damage. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert McCarthy from Boston, managed to ditch in the North Atlantic approximately 80 miles east of the Shetlands. All 9 crew members survived the crash and deployed the Olsen platform system from their survival equipment. McCarthy later described those moments in vivid detail. The B-17 hit the water hard, the impact throwing him against his harness. Cold Atlantic water rushed into the cockpit immediately. He and his co-pilot, Lieutenant James Parker from Ohio, kicked out the cockpit windows and pulled themselves free as the aircraft began to sink. The crew had trained for this moment, but training in a pool was nothing like the real Atlantic in August. The water temperature was 54 degrees, cold enough to kill in less than an hour. The waves were running at 4 feet, not enormous, but enough to make everything harder. McCarthy counted heads as they surfaced. 9 men, all alive, all struggling with their life vests in the turbulent water. The bombardier, Sergeant Thomas Walsh, had grabbed the Olsen platform package from its storage compartment before evacuating. It was a bright orange container, about the size of a large suitcase, designed to float. Walsh pulled the deployment cord, and the package burst open, the interconnected platforms spreading across the water in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. It was like watching a net deploy, McCarthy said later. These orange platforms just spreading out, connected by ropes, creating this visible zone around us. The closest one was maybe 30 yards away. 30 yards doesn't sound far, but in 4-foot seas, wearing a heavy flight suit and boots, exhausted from combat and the crash, it might as well have been a mile. McCarthy watched his crew struggle toward the platforms, some making good progress, others barely moving. The tail gunner, Corporal Eddie Martinez from California, was the youngest at 19. He'd taken a piece of shrapnel in the leg during the bombing run, and the pain combined with the cold was shutting him down. He kept slipping under the water, his life vest barely keeping him afloat. McCarthy reached Martinez first, grabbed his vest, and started dragging him toward the nearest platform. Parker helped from the other side. It took them 10 minutes to cover 30 yards, 10 minutes of fighting waves and cold and exhaustion. When they finally reached the platform, McCarthy didn't think he had the strength to lift Martinez into the catch basket. But the basket's design solved that problem. They guided Martinez to the wide opening, and the funnel shape did the rest. His body slid into the basket naturally, the buoyancy lifting him partially out of the water. McCarthy and Parker climbed into adjacent platforms, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. That basket saved my life, McCarthy wrote in his letter to Henrik. The moment I was out of the water, even just halfway out, I could feel the difference. I was still cold, but I wasn't dying anymore. I could pull the canvas cover over me, use the hand grips to stabilize myself. And I could see Walsh in the next platform, could see my whole crew spread across these connected platforms. We weren't drifting apart. We were together. That mattered more than I can explain. The rescue took 45 minutes from when they ditched to when a Catalina flying boat spotted the bright orange platforms and green dye marker from 6 miles away. A destroyer arrived 20 minutes later, pulling all 9 men from the water. They were hypothermic, exhausted. Martinez needed surgery for his leg, but all 9 were alive. When Henrik received McCarthy's letter 3 weeks later, he read it alone in his workshop, tears streaming down his face. Ingrid found him there an hour later, the letter still in his hands. 9 lives, she said softly. It worked, Henrik whispered. It actually worked. Of course it worked. You knew it would. No, I hoped it would. I believed it could. But knowing and hoping aren't the same as seeing proof. These 9 men, they're alive because of something I built. That's why you started this, Ingrid finished. That's why you spent months in that workshop, why you fought with Blackwood, why you drove yourself to exhaustion. This moment, right here, 9 men going home. Henrik folded the letter carefully, placed it in his jacket pocket. It's not enough. We need to produce more platforms, deploy them wider, train more crews on proper deployment procedures. Papa, I know what you're going to say, that I need to rest, that I've done enough. But now that I know it works, how can I rest? How can I slow down when there are more men out there who need this? Ingrid had no answer for that. The truth was, she understood. Her father had found something that gave meaning to all the loss and horror of the war. He'd found a way to fight back against the random cruelty of fate. How could anyone ask him to stop? The success stories multiplied through late summer and autumn. A Spitfire pilot recovered after 8 hours in the water. 4 men from a crashed Lancaster bomber, found by a destroyer that spotted their platform system in heavy fog. 2 American P-47 pilots who'd collided during a training exercise and managed to reach the same platform, keeping each other conscious until rescue arrived. Each story added to the growing legend of the Olsen platforms. Pilots started calling them life nets or Henrik's miracles. Some crews painted small platform symbols on their aircraft, good luck charms representing the possibility of survival if everything went wrong. One rescue in October particularly affected Henrik. A young Norwegian pilot, flying with the RAF, ditched his Mosquito fighter bomber after being hit by German night fighters over the North Sea. His name was Lars Johansson, and he was from Bergen, the same city where Henrik had been born. Lars was in the water for 6 hours before rescue arrived. A storm had delayed the search, and the seas were running at 12 feet, far worse than the platforms had been designed for. But the interconnected system held together, the catch baskets keeping Lars partially out of the water even as waves crashed over him repeatedly. When the rescue boat finally found him, Lars was barely conscious, his body temperature dangerously low, but he was alive. They flew him to the hospital in Scalloway, where doctors worked through the night to save him. Henrik visited 3 days later, when Lars had recovered enough to talk. "Mr. Olsen," Lars said in Norwegian, his voice hoarse, "they told me you built the platform that saved me." "I'm just glad it worked," Henrik replied in the same language, the familiar Norwegian words feeling like coming home. "It did more than work. For 6 hours, I lay in that basket, waves crashing over me. Sure, I was going to die, but the basket held me. And every time a wave tried to pull me under, the buoyancy lifted me back up. It was like having someone there with me, fighting to keep me alive." "The ocean is cruel," Henrik said, "but we can be more stubborn than it is cruel." Lars smiled weakly. "My mother lives in Bergen. I haven't seen her in 3 years since the occupation started. But because of you, I'll see her again when this war ends. How do you thank someone for that?" "You don't need to thank me. You just need to survive and go home to your mother." "I will. I promise you I will." Henrik left the hospital feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope that had driven him to build the platforms, but genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, they were winning this fight against the sea. By December, the Olsen platforms had been involved in rescuing over 140 Allied airmen. The survival rate for pilots ditching in the Atlantic had jumped from 30% to nearly 70% in areas where the platforms were deployed. The statistics were undeniable, the impact measurable in lives saved and families kept whole. Henrik should have been celebrating. Instead, he worked longer hours, refining the design, pushing for wider deployment, arguing with military bureaucrats about production priorities. Ingrid watched him deteriorate, the weight of every lost pilot crushing him despite the lives being saved. The breaking point came in mid-January. A Halifax bomber went down off the coast of Norway with 7 crew aboard. They had the platforms, deployed them correctly, did everything right. But the rescue was delayed by German patrol boats in the area, and by the time the Allied ships could safely reach them, 4 of the 7 had died from hypothermia. Henrik received the report on a Tuesday morning. He read it once, then read it again, his hands trembling. Then he walked out of the factory and kept walking, through Aberdeen streets, past the harbor, along the coastal road until his legs gave out. He sat on a stone wall overlooking the North Sea, the same sea that had taken those 4 men, and wept. Ingrid found him there 2 hours later. She'd known where he'd go, had given him the time he needed to process the loss. "Papa, you need to stop," she said, sitting beside him on the wall. They were both silent for a long moment, watching waves crash against the rocks below. "I keep seeing their faces," Henrik said finally. "Not their real faces, I never knew them, but I imagine what they looked like. Young men, someone's sons, maybe brothers or husbands, and they died in my baskets waiting for help that came too late. They would have died faster without your baskets. At least 3 survived because of you." 3 out of 7, less than half. "That's 3 men who get to go home, Papa. 3 families who won't get a telegram saying their son or husband is dead. Would you rather it was 0 out of 7? "I'd rather it was 7 out of 7, Henrik said, his voice breaking. "I'd rather my design was better, the deployment faster, the rescue procedures more efficient. I'd rather I was smarter, more skilled, more capable of solving this completely." "You're human, Papa, not God. You can't save everyone." "Then what's the point? If I can't save everyone, if the best I can do still lets men die in freezing water, What am I even accomplishing? Ingrid grabbed her father's face, forcing him to look at her. You're accomplishing the impossible. You're a 52-year-old fisherman who convinced the Royal Navy that he knew better than their engineers. You designed something that's saving lives every single week. You've given hope to pilots who thought ditching in the Atlantic was a death sentence. That's what you're accomplishing. It's not enough. It never will be. That's the curse of caring, Papa. Every life saved makes you aware of the ones you couldn't reach. But you can't let the ones you couldn't save erase the value of the ones you did. Those 3 men from the Halifax, they're alive. McCarthy and his crew, 9 men, alive. Lars Johansson, alive and going to see his mother again. All of them breathing, living, having futures because you were too stubborn to accept that your ridiculous idea couldn't work. I'm so tired, Ingrid. I know, so take a day off, sleep, eat a real meal. Let yourself feel proud of what you've accomplished before you rush back to improving it. The platforms will still be there tomorrow. The men who need saving will still be there, but you won't be able to help anyone if you work yourself to death. Henrik looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. She'd lost weight, dark circles under her eyes, revealing the toll his obsession had taken on her as well. She'd been carrying him through this, managing the factory, dealing with the military bureaucracy, keeping him fed and functional. And he'd been so focused on the work that he hadn't seen the cost she was paying. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm so sorry, Ingrid. You've been taking care of everything, taking care of me, and I haven't even noticed. Don't be sorry. Just take a day off. Sleep, eat a real meal. Let yourself feel proud of what you've accomplished. They sat together on that wall for another hour, watching the sea, neither one speaking. Sometimes silence was enough. Sometimes just being together was the only comfort available in a world at war. The true scale of that accomplishment became clear in the spring of 1944. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, air operations intensified dramatically. Thousands of sorties filled the skies over the English Channel and the North Sea. Bomber streams, targeting German positions, fighter sweeps, reconnaissance missions. The skies had never been so crowded or so dangerous. The Olsen platforms were now standard equipment on almost every aircraft operating over water. Production had scaled up to meet demand, with manufacturing facilities in Britain, Canada, and the United States producing the systems. Henrik's design had been refined and improved, but the core concept remained unchanged. By D-Day, June 6th, the platforms had been involved in rescuing over 250 pilots and aircrew. The number continued to climb through the summer as the air war intensified. Fighter pilots dogfighting over the channel, bomber crews attacking German supply lines, transport aircraft shot down during operations. The rescue statistics were stark and undeniable. In areas where Olsen platforms were deployed, survival rates approached 80%. In areas without them, the rate remained below 40%. Commander Blackwood, who'd initially dismissed Henrik's design, became one of its strongest advocates. He wrote reports, testified before committees, pushed for expanded production and deployment. His conversion from skeptic to believer was complete. I was wrong, Blackwood told Henrik during a meeting in August. I should have listened to you from the beginning. My pride cost lives, and I'll have to live with that. But I want you to know that your design has fundamentally changed maritime rescue operations. After the war, this system will save lives in civilian contexts as well. You've created something lasting. Henrik accepted the words with a nod, but compliments bounced off him. The only thing that mattered was the number of men coming home alive. The final tally came in December 1944. Since operational deployment began in July 1943, the Olsen platform system had been directly involved in rescuing 307 Allied airmen from the Atlantic, North Sea, and English Channel. 307 men who would have died, who went home instead to families and futures. The Air Ministry wanted to give Henrik a medal, organize a ceremony, create publicity around the story. He refused all of it. He didn't want recognition or fame. He wanted to return to Norway when the war ended and go back to fishing. But Margaret Thornton convinced him to attend one event. A small gathering at a pub in London, no press, no cameras, just the people who'd worked on the project and some of the pilots who'd been rescued by the platforms. Henrik stood in the corner, uncomfortable with the attention, nursing a whiskey he wasn't drinking. Ingrid worked the room, accepting thanks on behalf of her father, translating stories between Norwegian and English. Lieutenant McCarthy, the B-17 pilot from the first successful rescue, found Henrik in his corner. Mr. Olsen, McCarthy said, extending his hand. I wanted to thank you in person. You already wrote me a letter, Henrik replied. That was enough. Oh no, it wasn't. Because of you, I got to go home. I got to marry my fiancée. I'm going to be a father in March. My child will exist because you were too stubborn to accept that your idea was ridiculous. Henrik's eyes filled with tears. I just wanted to save lives. You did. You saved mine. You saved 300 others. That's a hell of a legacy for a fisherman. I'm just a fisherman, Henrik said softly. I know nets and boats and water. That's all. That's not all, McCarthy replied. You're the man who proved that sometimes the best solutions come from the people who actually understand the problem. The military brass, with all their engineering degrees, they couldn't figure it out. But a Norwegian fisherman who'd spent his life reading the ocean, he saw what they couldn't. Other pilots approached, each with their own story of survival, their own gratitude. Henrik listened to them all, shaking hands, accepting thanks he felt he didn't deserve. Each story carved itself into his memory, validation that his obsessive work had mattered. When the gathering ended, Henrik and Ingrid walked through the London streets, the blackout making the city feel vast and empty despite its millions of inhabitants. Are you going to go back to fishing when the war ends? Ingrid asked. I don't know, Henrik admitted. Part of me wants to. Part of me feels like I should keep working on rescue systems, improving designs, training people. There's so much more that could be done. Papa, you've already done more than most people accomplish in 5 lifetimes. It's okay to rest. Is it, when there are still people who need help? Yes, it is. You taught me that engineers and military experts aren't always right. But you also need to learn that you can't carry the weight of every tragedy by yourself. You built something amazing. You saved lives. Now you need to trust that others can carry it forward. Henrik stopped walking, looking at his daughter. When did you become so wise? I learned from my father, she said, smiling. The stubborn Norwegian fisherman who told a Royal Navy commander that his proven technology wasn't good enough. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Henrik Olsen returned to Norway in June, to a country recovering from 5 years of occupation. His village had been damaged but not destroyed, and the fishing fleet was slowly being rebuilt. He bought a new boat and returned to the waters he'd known his entire life. The Olsen platform system remained in use by military and civilian rescue services, its design continuing to save lives long after the guns fell silent. Over the following decades, variations of Henrik's concept would become standard equipment for maritime rescue operations worldwide. Henrik never sought recognition for his work. He went back to fishing, living quietly in his coastal village, occasionally consulting on maritime safety projects, but mostly preferring the simple rhythm of the sea. He died in 1972 at the age of 81 in the same house where he'd been born. At his funeral, Ingrid read letters from some of the men her father had saved, pilots who'd built lives and families, who'd named children after the Norwegian fishermen who'd given them a second chance. 307 lives saved, but the real number was incalculable when you counted the children and grandchildren who existed because those men came home. The North Atlantic still claims lives, still tests anyone brave or foolish enough to challenge its power, but because a stubborn Norwegian fisherman refused to accept that his ridiculous idea couldn't work, because he understood the ocean better than the experts, and had the courage to trust his knowledge, thousands of people came home who otherwise wouldn't have. Henrik Olsen never considered himself a hero. He was just a fisherman who saw a problem and applied what he knew to solve it. Sometimes, that's all heroism really is. Ordinary people using their particular expertise to make the world a little bit safer, a little bit kinder, one life at a time. His legacy wasn't monuments or medals. It was the simple mathematics of survival. 307 men pulled from the sea who got to go home and live the futures they'd been fighting for.